Hey there. It's time for another Toolbox Tech Talk. Hey, this is going to be a bit of a weird one. The live stream actually failed, so this is a recorded live stream. Well, anyway, I'm here and I've made a little presentation for you all about labels, so I'm definitely going to get into it. Yeah. So first up, thanks everyone for turning up and then nothing, me not showing live, but actually turning up later as a recording. So hope you get to watch this. The other thing I want to say a really big thank you to is Charles Graves. Now, Charles sent me this lovely T-shirt here. There we go. He lives on beautiful Waiheke Island, just off the coast of Auckland, New Zealand. It's a beautiful place. And looks like they do a bit of TT racing there. Charles is a regular viewer of my channel, and this was actually a birthday present, so thank you very much, Charles. Now, in case you've been living under a rock in Australia, we just had a federal election last night, something of a landslide for Labor re-elected. What does that mean for our industry, for the solar and battery industry? It's a big hooray because the alternative was basically closing down renewables. So as a result, we are expected to have a huge battery boosting scheme. So it was announced before the election, $2.3 billion over the next 5 years, uncapped. So that means that $2.3 billion isn't actually capped, it can be more, to support both commercial and residential battery storage systems up to 50 kilowatt hours of usable energy at a rate of around about, and these figures will come out with the regulations, but around about $370 a kilowatt hour. So if you're putting in a 50 kilowatt hour battery for a factory or for your home, that's something like $17,500, $18,000 worth of rebate. That's pretty amazing. It doesn't start till the 1st of July. Even though in the briefings that were given by the government beforehand, they did say you could install it now, but not switch it on to the 1st of July. I don't know if you would want to risk that. It's a difficult business model to tell people not to turn their system on, and also a risk, I suppose, for installers. But anyway, so what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about labels and labels. Whoops, pressed the wrong button then. Labels, something that comes up in my feed and my emails, SMSs, all sorts of things, chat regularly, because it is an area that there's been a lot of confusion around, and I really kind of wanted to kind of lay to rest some of the confusion, but I don't think I can solve all of your problems, because ultimately, the authority that enforces the labelling may have their own views. Why am I saying that? So depending on which country you're in, Australia or New Zealand, you might have state regulators or national regulators who have requirements for specific labels. So for instance, here in Victoria, we have a little green label that no other state needs. Not quite sure what its purpose is, but we have that. But you have to do it. That's how the regulations work. So what I'm going to do, I've got a few little slides here I'm going to run you through. I want to talk a bit about where labels go and how to correctly label a solar and battery storage system. Now, it might seem pretty straightforward. You get a label kit from your supplier and you just stick them everywhere. But actually putting too many labels which aren't applicable, actually is a problem. And what we need is the right label in the right place. So let's have a look at that. But before I actually get down into the actual labels, let's talk about why and how labelling comes about. So labelling comes out of our Australian New Zealand standards, and I'm talking very much about the Australian context here. It's a little bit different in New Zealand, where the New Zealand electricity regulations have to reference a particular edition of a standard, whereas in Australia, once a standard has been published, after the adoption period, or it's usually 6 months, it's enforced. So in the Australian context, Australian standards are not legally binding by themselves. So just because you might go onto Standards Australia website and find a standard for something or other, it doesn't actually make it legally binding. It only gains legal force when they are referenced in legislation or regulation. So don't assume that Australian standards are a law unto their own. they are generally best practice, or in the case of product standards, something that a product can try and achieve compliance to for various reasons. But on their own, they are a voluntary technical document. Provides guidelines and best practice for things like safety, quality, and performance. But they do get incorporated into law. So, for instance, they become legally enforceable when a regulation or an act of parliament, for instance, or something like a construction code references them. And let's take the Australian National Construction Code or the Electrical Safety Acts in each of the states. Once they're referenced, that standard becomes mandatory. So an example of our Australian National Construction Code, the wiring rules, AS/NZS 3000, is cited, and it's in state-based electrical safety regulations as well. So it can be referenced in a contract. So you might actually have a contract with a supplier to build something, install something, or provide a product to a particular Australian standard or New Zealand standard. So it can be in contracts. And C, which is kind of an interesting one, by court decision. Now, I have heard this being referenced in New Zealand when it comes to things like the battery standard, AS/NZS 5139, which is not yet referenced in New Zealand electricity regulations. However, it does provide best practice advice. So it could be used in a court of law that you're not complying with a reasonable standard of care by complying with that standard. So, even though it may not be in state regulations or acts of parliament, it can come down to courts as well. So let's take an example that's embedded in law, the National Construction Code. It references over 100 Australian standards. And the big ones, of course, are work, health and safety, things about safety of personal protective equipment requirements, machinery safety, etc. But also electrical licensing acts in states will require compliance to AS/NZS 3000 and I'm going to explain why, AS/NZS 4777 Part 1, which is the installation standard for inverter systems. So let's dive into that. Now, how does that happen? How does 4777 Part 1 get brought into law? It's through a referenced standard like 3000. So 3000 is referenced in state electricity regulations in all states and territories in Australia. But within AS/NZS 3000, there's something that's known as a normative reference. Now, normative, there's a list at the beginning of the standard. Normative means in order to comply with this document, you must fully comply with all the normative standards as well. So it's effectively binding those other standards, like 4777 Part 1, to the regulations through a pathway in 3000. So in contrast, informative references are just advice and guidance, and they're not mandatory. So usually you'll find those at the back of a standard. There will be an appendix called informative, can provide some useful information, but it's not required to comply. So let's take an example. When does AS 4777 Part 1 take precedence? Now, precedence as in if 3000 says do A, but 4777 Part 1 says do B, in that circumstance, you do B, right? And this is where a lot of the confusion comes about, particularly with labelling. There may be some examples in 3000, and given that it's like the 2018 edition that we're using, with a few amendments after that, it's kind of out of date. So take clause 7.3.1.1 from 3000. Inverters for the supply of energy to the installation shall comply with the requirements of AS/NZS 4777 Part 1. Right, so there you go. And that's a normative standard. So actually to comply with 3000, for that clause, you have to comply with 4777 Part 1. Then you jump down to Part 1, and 4777 Part 1, and it provides you with the specific details to comply. So this is definitely a normative requirement, and it means that if you're installing an inverter that can feed power back to an installation, such as a grid-connected or hybrid system, you must also comply with 4777 Part 1. and that includes labelling requirements. So in section 2, 1.7, this section lists all documents that are integral to the compliance of 3000, and so it lists all those normative standards, things like 4509 Part 1, 5139, etc. And 4777 Part 1 is typically listed as a normative standard in 3000. So there you go. That's example number 1. So what about other applications? So when does 4777 Part 1 take precedence again over 3000 is where there's legal implication through what's known as a cascade, a flow of legal enforceability. So state regulations, for example, I'm from Victoria. Victoria's regulations, which I've got there on the screen, mandate compliance to AS NZS 3000. And once again, that cascade is into 3000 is the normative references for 4777 Part 1, and therefore 4777 Part 1 becomes legally enforceable via 3000. Okay, I think you get the picture now. And kind of in summary, a normative reference makes another standard integral to complying with that primary standard, and 3000 normatively references 4777 among many other standards that you must follow, and therefore it's legally enforceable and is cited in legislation and or regulation. So there you go. That's how we end up having to use a standard like 4777 Part 1 for labelling of an inverter system. So let's actually look at some of those very labels. And this is not an exhaustive list. I've kind of tried to pick some of my favourite ones, the ones that have come up a bit in discussion. What do we call the solar-only inverter main switch? Now, 4777 Part 1, the 2024 edition, which was published last year, of course, is now fully enforced since, I think, May this year in all states and territories in Australia. It's still not referenced to New Zealand electricity regulations, so it's probably not applicable, but maybe best practice advice, who knows. Say hot tip, I do believe, hang on, I'm even going to cut for this. A little bird's been talking to me, and it sounds like, for those Kiwis, that you are going to get an update this year. I know I've been saying that for a long time, but this birdie's speaking very formally to me, and it does sound like probably around September we will see a whole bunch of standards updated in New Zealand to hopefully the current versions, which is absolutely huge news for solar and battery industry in New Zealand. Anyway, back to this example. So what changed in 4777 Part 1, it was in 2024, was that we actually tried to tighten up compliance with 3000 in terms of labelling of main switches. So, for instance, in 3000, they talk about main switches for alternative supplies and main switches for supplementary supplies, etc. Substitute supplies, sorry. There's also a few others, supplementary and independent. All of those are defined now in 4777 Part 1, 2024. But the example labels given actually changed colour. So you might have been used to seeing labels that had black lettering on a white background, but suddenly they appeared, or at least some of them did, as I'm showing here on the screen, red lettering on a white background. And it caused a little bit of a kerfuffle, particularly with label makers. But I'll explain a bit about why it's not quite as it may appear. I'll come to that next. So let's just talk about these three examples. So a standard solar installation with just a solar inverter and some PV panels and a single AC output is providing what's known as a supplementary supply. That means if the grid fails, it goes off. It can only supplement the grid, it can't replace it. And as a supplementary supply, it shall be labelled main switch inverter. And where there is more than one IES supplementary supply, other wording associated with the energy source may be added. So, for instance, main switch, solar inverter, because you might have another supplementary supply or at least another solar inverter. So there's your standard solar main switch label. Number two is for systems that provide backup when the grid fails. And that's known as an alternative supply. It's an alternative to the grid when the grid fails, and therefore it's a main switch alternative. Now, I can see the example here actually says main switch battery alternative, but that just happened to be the label I had lying around in my collection. What the standard actually says is just the words main switch alternative. It doesn't mention energy type or energy source as part of that. Since I mentioned energy source labeling, it is a requirement to indicate the energy sources that are supplying an installation. Now, you're all very familiar, I'm sure, with the circular disc with the letters PV on it, the green circular 100 millimeter disc with the letters PV. That is an energy source label, basically letting first responders and other people know who need to know that there is solar connected to this installation. Also, if you have a energy storage system, you'll have the similar sign, a 100 millimeter green disc with reflective white lettering with the letters ES and the UN number for the chemistry of the energy storage system. So energy source labeling is actually a separate requirement. Well, it's a requirement, but it can be a separate label. It doesn't actually have to be written on the main switch itself. So when you see the words main switch battery alternative, it's not quite right because energy source labeling actually requires the chemistry as well. So as long as you've got that circular green sign with ES. So that's main switch alternative is number 2. Number 3 is a little bit special. Number 3 is what's known as an independent supply. Now, I probably need to give an example of products that do this. So let's say you've got a Cellectronic SP Pro. It's got a source input, which can be from the grid, and it's got a load port, which is, to power essential loads or the home. And that's a bidirectional port, so it can actually take energy on that port and charge batteries as well. But what it means by independent is that it has no capability of exporting to the grid. So it might come as a surprise to you that there are inverters that can't export to the grid. They can only use the grid as a source. And that's a special category in 4777 Part 2, the test standard. That's called Appendix M. So other examples would be Victron also can meet Appendix M requirements. That means that the connection to the grid is not a main switch. It is actually a main isolator for the grid input. So it'll be called main isolator, not main isolator, isolator grid input. And where that supply connects to a switchboard, it'll be a main isolator for the grid if there is a distribution board supplied from that main switchboard. So number 3 is it's kind of a special category, which is independent power that can operate independently of the grid. I suppose the level of independence depends on if you also have AC coupled solar. If you've just got let's take an example of a Cellectronic SP Pro, and it's got a battery system connected to it. Without solar, you're just going to run off that battery till it completely discharges. But if you have a AC coupled inverter on the load side, such as a Fronius S-Cert inverter, solar inverter, then you can recharge that battery from the AC coupling. So that's number 3, main switch independent. Now, I did mention that there were examples given in 4777 Part 1 2024, which showed the main switch labels as red lettering on a white background. It's actually not required to be red on white. It is just one means of distinguishing main switches from other switchgear. So this clause comes from AS/NZS 3000, clause 2.3.3.5, which says each main switch shall be marked main switch, magic words, and shall be readily distinguishable from other switchgear by means of, and there's a list, grouping. Now, it's quite common in New South Wales to actually have a half pole width between the main switch and other circuits, so that's grouping by contrasting colours, i.e. using red for main switches and black for other circuit protection, or other suitable means to provide prompt operation in emergency. Not quite sure what those other suitable means might be, but there you go. So colour is just one way of achieving this distinguishing main switches from other circuits. All right, so let's go into ASNZS 5139, battery isolator labeling. Now, this really applies to systems typically in sections 5 and 6, though in 6 you can also have some all-in-one systems, but ones all-in-one systems which are not compliant with the best practice guide, but there's probably very few that would bother. So when you have a section 5 system, for instance, you've got a inverter, so PCE, and it's connected via cabling to a battery system. And that battery system needs to have a point of isolation. So it's two separate components, basically, with an isolator between them. And therefore, it's isolating the battery DC cables. So it needs to be labelled battery system DC isolator. It may be combined as a overcurrent protection device, or they may be separate. It's most common to use, say, an MCCB for large currents as the combined DC isolator and overcurrent protection, but it could be HRC fuses in line on both poles as a separate switch disconnector as the isolator. So that is the battery system DC isolator. It is not a main switch, right? It's just an isolator. Okay. Shutdown procedures. Now, I've actually given an example of one that credit to Aussie Solar Labels and Solar Batteries Online, who kind of constructed this, I think, together. It's an example of a very thorough shutdown procedure with some specifics about how to even access the required shutdown items, such as the PV array, DC isolator, and on-off button. Now, what it's required is that that shutdown procedure be adjacent to the PCE, i.e. the inverter, or if the inverter's already adjacent to a switchboard, it can be at that switchboard. The idea is that in an emergency, it can be operated or can be accessed quickly at a location where the operator can read it and then take the following steps. It also should include emergency contact information and a manufacturer or a supplier. So note that on this example, the supplier, which is Solar Batteries Online, I believe, they've got the URL on there, which is nice. And they've also got a QR code taking you to the safety data sheet for this product. This is a SIG Energy Siege and Store system. Now, I should add that Energy Safety Victoria have told me that they don't accept a QR code in lieu of a physical safety data sheet on site. They say that it can be smudged or made illegible. It may be that there is no internet on site, so the QR code can't be resolved to an actual document. So they still want a physical copy of the safety data sheet. That's Energy Safety Victoria. But it doesn't help to make it easy as possible, and there it is as a QR code. So well done. Just to reiterate then, so in 5139, the battery standard, the PCE, the shutdown procedure adjacent to the PCE, or where there's a switchboard that it's directly connected to in close proximity, it can be at that switchboard. Okay. All right. How many signs do you need to put up? I'm just showing you a kit here. This is a kit from Aussie Solar Labels. Big shout out to them for providing me with a lot of samples of their labels for training purposes. Just because you get a label kit doesn't mean you have to use them all. They're there for you to use as required. I would even go as far as to say putting up signs that aren't required is a hazard. It's giving false information. And there's even some signs which are optional. There's one of mine, sun at work. Because most of our signs are like, don't do it, it's going to kill you. How about it's just a sunny day? Yeah, so there you go. Now, I've just got, I think, 3 more to go over with you. This one's a bit of a curly one. Battery explosion hazard. I have seen so many questions. Do you need to put this on a lithium battery? Okay, so the battery standard has a table 3.1, which lists hazard classifications. And where there is a tick in a hazard classification, that means it's a mandatory hazard and you need to comply with it. So lead acid batteries get a tick. You definitely need risk of battery explosion signs. nickel alkaline equally. Both of those vent hydrogen and oxygen when they're charging, and therefore there's a risk of igniting that hydrogen with a naked flame. But lithium gets a tick and a half. It gets a tick, then a note. So this is where all the confusion comes around. Note 3 says lithium chemistries that release hydrogen under fault, important word there, fault conditions, should be considered an explosive gas hazard. How do you know? They even give an example. Lithium manganese is one type of lithium-ion battery, not very common at all. So considering most lithium-ion batteries in residential and installations are lithium ferrophosphate or lithium nickel manganese cobalt or lithium nickel cobalt arsenide, I'm not sure if any of those release hydrogen. So how do you find out? Well, that's where a safety data sheet should list the risks associated with a battery system. So I'm probably going out on a limb here saying you probably should use the safety data sheet as your guide to whether there is a hazard of an explosive gas being released under fault conditions. But not all safety data sheets are made equal. Some are a little bit thin on some of that information. So I guess the safest thing to do is actually to put the sign on. But if you have a high level of trust in that safety data sheet, then maybe this is not required for lithium batteries. So there you go. Bit of a tricky one. And it also says down the bottom there in clause 7.8, all battery system types categorized as an explosive gas hazard shall have this sign adjacent to the battery or on all doors of the room where the battery is located. So that's an or. So if you do have a shed, for instance, it would make sense to put it on the outside of the shed rather than walking in there with your cigarette and go, oh my gosh, I shouldn't have come in here smoking because I didn't see the sign till it's too late. So there you go. What about toxic fume hazard? This is probably one of the scariest signs to stick on a residential battery. It sort of like makes you kind of fearful. So let's have a look at table 3.1. Lithium ion gets a tick for toxic fume hazard. Now that tick means it's a mandatory risk. Doesn't mean it's based on your reading of a safety data sheet or what the manufacturer tells you. It is actually listed as a mandatory risk, and therefore you do need the toxic fume hazard. I guess really from a caution point of view, lithium-ion batteries are quite dangerous when they're venting. So people might think it's only fire that's the issue. Actually, the electrolyte in lithium-ion batteries is lithium hexafluorophosphate. And when that's heated up and there's a rupture in the cell, if it doesn't ignite, which is pretty common, but if it doesn't ignite, it will release that gas as a sort of white powder or white gas. It's a gas, sorry, not a powder. It's a white gas. And it forms hydrogen fluoride with contact with any air that has moisture in it, so pretty much everywhere. So you've now got hydrogen fluoride floating around, which if you know your chemistry, that's a very corrosive acid. You don't want to breathe it in. So breathing in acid gas, hydrogen fluoride actually corrodes glass, let alone lung tissue. So it is definitely a toxic fume. So being aware that if your lithium battery is venting, exit the room and contact emergency services. Don't go and try and drag it out. We would probably have to disconnect it and unbolt it, and you're breathing in all these toxic fumes. So really the only safe way of getting access to it at that point would be using forced breathing apparatus, which I'm sure you won't have at home. So there you go. It is a mandatory sign for lithium-ion batteries. Now this is the one that kind of irks me. I see it a lot put on lithium batteries because it comes in the kit. It comes in a kit with signage often, and it's quite a big sign, and it's an electrolyte burns sign. So 5139 says that if the battery system contains liquid chemical hazards, you need to have this sign, this chemical hazard sign. And additionally, you need, and this is what I think is kind of fun, bunding and spill trays within the battery system or enclosure to capture that liquid hazard. Now, really, this is written for flooded lead-acid batteries. You'll notice actually in clause 6363, it says that valve-regulated lead-acid batteries, which actually have an electrolyte, sulfuric acid electrolyte, but bonded into a gel do not require spill trays because the gel doesn't flow as a liquid. Now, the same is true of lithium-ion batteries. Even though they have a electrolyte, lithium hexafluorophosphate, inside them, it doesn't drain out. It's not a pool of liquid. It's basically absorbed into into sort of mats between the plates, or the anode and cathode in each of the cells. So yeah, you don't require the electrolyte burn sign. I jokingly say if you're going to put it on a lithium battery, you better put bunding as well, because you're basically saying there's a spillage hazard. So there you go. And I think that brings me to the end of my little how to label a battery and solar system. Look, apologies once again for those who are expecting this to be a live stream, and then the live stream didn't happen and I had to do it as a recorded, but it should be uploaded very fast. The next Toolbox Tech Talk, hopefully I will have solved these little technical hiccups, and we'll be going live on Sunday the 11th of May at 1 p.m. So looking forward to that. So there you go. That's DJ Glen over and out from Toolbox Tech Talk.